Some of the native plants that come with Vue have some issues with them, to say the least. Uh, there's a couple of different issues and problems with the native content that I do want to show you, because sometimes it's not going to be as obvious as a hooking point for a leaf being off. So the main issues we're going to take a look at right now are hooking points being in the wrong place upon load for the species, incorrect transparency maps being used, which can result in flickering in an animation and also increase render time. And then we're also going to take a look at the effects of texture filtering on some of the species and exactly how texture filtering works within the renderer and really what can happen to some of the plants depending on the filter that's used. And then there's one additional problem we're going to take a look at, which really doesn't affect render output, only OpenGL display. But correcting OpenGL leaves can be really useful, since it is the fastest way for us to preview the scene without having to render it. Technically, there is one other problem that I've only seen with one plant, and I will show you that. But it really only affects one plant. It's not something that you'll find more common. I'm going to start by loading in plant species. So selecting the load plant from species, you can right click on the plant icon. We're going to load in a species that's actually affected by two different problems. And what we're going to load in is the cone-shaped conifer. Now, the most obvious of the errors is that the hooking point is incorrect in the plant. Now, if you don't know what the hooking point is, we'll go ahead and take a look within the plant editor. So we can go ahead and edit the object. And under our leaf subsets, we have the available materials for this species. There's a little leaf icon on the bottom of each one that allows you to adjust the hooking point, which is this red dot. You can also use this to load in additional color and alpha transparency maps. Now, the hooking point is what's going to connect to the end of the branch. Because it was in the center, you're going to have this weird stem kind of sticking out in different places, and it's also going to affect the way the flexibility and the curl options are going to affect the polygons creating the leaves. So an easy fix for these ones is just to change the hooking point. It'll update the object, and then we can go into the other material and do the same thing. Now, sometimes in the plant editor, the changes you make to the leaves don't stick. So what you can do is just go to the new plant to grow another plant from the species, and that usually makes sure that everything stays correct. You can click OK to close out the plant editor, and now the hooking points are going to be set up correctly. Once you've made changes to the plant, in order to make sure that they stay whenever you load the plant in, because you can't edit objects or edit plants when they're used as ecosystems if they're not actually loaded into the scene, at least not anymore. Used to be able to a few versions ago, but they did remove that feature, which was part of the master object addition mode. What we can do is go into the plant editor, and if you want to save the species, you can go up to Save Plant Species and create a new version of it that is corrected. Now, I would definitely suggest, if you're going to be updating the species, that you do change the display unit. So File Options, Units and Coordinates, setting the default display unit to 1 view unit equals 0.1 meters, and you're going to want to set that before you load the plant in. Now this scene was originally set up for 1 unit when I loaded the plant in. So now that I've changed it to 0.1 meters, if you go into the numerics tab and take a look at the scale, it is, instead of being 18 meters by 19 by 31, it is in fact 1.8, 1.9, and 3.1. So all we need to do in this case is just move that decimal over for each of the axes, and just to make sure that we have the bark set correctly too, in this case we will have to also change the scale of any of the bark materials, and basically change those from 0.1 to 1, and leaves are not affected by the scale changes of the preserve size of natural elements at time of creation, and that's within the general preferences under object options. And you'll find more information about this setting and how it affects the scene within the units section on the units lesson for the natural element creation within the training. Another thing you'll notice is if we go to back to the numerics tab and we turn off the real world size, it does show 1 being the view unit all the way across, and before I changed those settings it was 0.1. So now when I save this species, it will load correctly and match up with the scale changes that are made, and that'll make more sense if you've watched the section about the way the natural element unit is worked out and in use within ecosystems and other areas of the program. Now, even if the hooking points on this one were intended to be a little more towards the center, there's still another issue with this plant. And it's not going to be obvious until you start rendering an animation using texture filtering. And this is going to affect both the integrated version of xStream, also Infinite in the standalone version. And of course, Complete, Vue Studio, whatever version you happen to be using. The reason it affects xStream within the host application is because all texture anti-aliasing is controlled by Vue. So we're going to take a look at this in comparison to another plant species, so you can really see the difference. So I'm going to load in the bulky conifer, which is right next to the cone-shaped conifer. Now we shouldn't actually need any animation frames or any camera animation to see the impacts of what's going on with the material. So first let's just take a look at a render, and we'll see a big difference between the two. Now the texture filtering is going to show up within the anti-aliasing, and it is enabled with anything above final render for the preset qualities. We can't access the anti-aliasing within the render preset. One thing you can do is if you do want to base it off one of these presets but modify texture filtering, is you can go into the user settings and select to load a render setting. And within the environment folder of the Vue installation, you'll find all of the different render quality modes. So if we wanted the broadcast, we could load that in, and now we have access to the broadcast mode where we can modify the settings. So if we take a look under the advanced effects the anti-aliasing, and see the texture filtering, it's set to 33%. This is sort of a blur for texture maps. And it can help reduce flickering. Now, there are a few settings within the program or within the leaf material that modify this. I'm going to go ahead and just keep these settings for the broadcast mode, except change the geometry quality threshold up to 90, which is what I usually use. And we'll keep texture anti-aliasing. We'll go ahead and turn that off for now and just take a look at the filtering and see what's going to happen. I'll go ahead and render this to the screen. I'll just do 1600 by 900. I'm going to turn off depth of field because that was turned on. Now, with a still image, what happens to the texture isn't incredibly obvious with this large of a render because we are able to see more pixels. But you can clearly see a difference in the smoothing and kind of the graininess of it. Now, the texture filtering is supposed to smooth things out, and with the cone-shaped conifer on the right, we don't have that happening. We've got a very harsh bump map, and if we take a look at the shadow, and I'll just go ahead and zoom in, we have a very sharp shadow as opposed to our other plant, which is smoothed out a lot more. Now I also have frames that I'd rendered earlier from small animation, or a couple frames from an animation. They are a little smaller, but the effect becomes more obvious, where we've got the bulky conifer right here to the left of the cone-shaped conifer, which is this pixelated mess. With some improvement of the quality of the motion blur, you can still see just a huge difference between the two. Now, because of this, if you're moving fairly fast, or the camera's moving fairly quickly through the animation, you're basically going to reach a point where the leaves and everything on the tree itself is basically going to disappear, and you're not going to see anything except the trunk, and with a few leaves kind of coming in here or there. This is what it looks like when it's corrected. Now, the plant itself does use a pretty thin alpha for the needles, so that's why it is thinner overall, but for the most part there's a huge difference. Now, the camera does move a little bit here, but you can still see a huge difference in the quality between the two. So in order to reduce this effect and remove any flickering that's going to be caused by it, because the bump maps and different things like that are going to cause some issues with the flickering within an animation, what we'll do is take a look at the material for the cone-shaped conifer for the branches. Now, we can access the material directly from the plant editor. If we edit the object and go into our leaf subset, we can right-click, edit material, we can double-click to open the material editor. We can also go over to the materials tab, and we have everything selected that's from the plant because the plant is selected. But we can open them up that way by double-clicking, or we can go up here to the aspect tab and kind of use the arrows on the bottom to go between each subset. So it really doesn't matter where we edit this, unless you're having issues with OpenGL updating. If you're creating custom plants, sometimes it's best to go through the plant editor. Now, what we're going to see in the transparency filter is that it is clipped towards the center, and what this is really doing is making sure that you've got an image that's only black and white, and there are no in-between pixels, because all alphas for plants should have no smooth edges. They're going to look really jagged up close, but they'll render much better. Now, the problem with this method, as opposed to just modifying the image, is that it does limit the texture filtering to the high and low point range of this filter. It has a direct impact on it. So it's a little hard to tell that this would cause that problem. So once we remove that, we can just right click and reset the filter. It's going to open that back up, and we can go into the second leaf subset, reset the filter under transparency, and now this plant is corrected. Now I probably shouldn't have moved the camera, so the comparison will be a little bit off. We'll go ahead and render another version. So even though I've moved the camera a little bit, you can see a very large difference between the quality of these two. Now it's still got a bit of graininess to it, and that's actually due to the bump map because texture anti-aliasing is currently turned off. So if we turn on texture anti-aliasing or remove the bump map, it will smooth out that surface. But if we take a look now, and we'll see it where we can have the shadow and the tree showing. Before, where we had these really harsh edges and it didn't match the texture filtering on the other plant. If we take a look, we can see those harsh edges as it was before. It's now nice and smoothed out. So that can really help improve your usage of this species and help you diagnose a problem that might show up on another species, because this might not be the only one that has that transparency filter, and I do know that for a fact. I haven't gone through absolutely every single species to make sure they don't have this problem, so you will just kind of have to go in and check and see. So now that those problems are fixed, we can go into the plant, make sure that its position is set to 0 on the X, Y, and Z. We can edit the plant, and then we're going to save as a species, new plant species. And I'm just going to save this to my installation directory just to make sure that all the texture maps and everything are going to match up, because I'm not going to be incorporating the texture maps. So we'll just call it cone-shaped conifer fixed. And this tree will not be included with the content, so you will have to make these changes yourself just to keep file sizes down and also ensure that the texture maps are found correctly and there's no problems on that side. So now if we go to load in a species, we should be able to find the cone-shaped conifer fixed that I just put in there. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at is a problem with the alpha on some of the plants, where the wrong file is really being used, or you might find a JPEG used as a transparency map, which is just a terrible idea. So some of these things just haven't been updated, so you might just have to go in and modify it yourself if you're having any issues. We're going to go over to the texture map, or the links folder here in the library tab, and if you want to increase the scale of the preview, you can go down to the lower right and just click and hold down on those arrows to enlarge. Now this is the alpha for that conifer branch. It is saved as a GIF, so I do know that it's correct, because all the GIF texture maps for the native content are indexed so that there is only black and white. We can double click to open it up. And if we take a look at this in Photoshop, we'll see that it is an indexed image, and all we have are black and white pixels. So that filter that was applied isn't needed for this to clip anything out. And in some cases, you might want to have a little bit of a sharper image where it isn't affected by the texture filtering as much. But in this case, it's really more of a matter of matching it to the rest of the species, because it's a lot easier to change one plant than to go in and change all of the species to have the same texture filtering. So it's just to avoid any unpredictable results. Now, we are going to take a look at one of the other species that has a problem with the transparency, and I'm pretty sure there are a couple of them that you'll run into. So I've just deleted those plants from the scene. We're going to right click and then we're going to load in the plum tree. It's a nice lightweight tree for scenes. So I do suggest fixing it. If we go over to Links tab and take a look, what we'll find is that the transparency map is a JPEG. Now the problem with this is if we go ahead and open it up and we zoom in, and I'm using a Picasa photo viewer for this, what we'll find is that you've got a lot of gray pixels on the outside, and a lot of the leaves have some in-between values. Now this is being kind of blurred from the image interpolation of this program, so I'll go ahead and show it to you with Photoshop. So if we zoom into this in Photoshop, we'll see that it's really a mess, and this is going to cause some problems. It's going to increase the chances of the plant flickering. It's going to increase the render time as well. So to correct this, you really need another application like Photoshop to fix it. If you don't have a 2D editing application, photographic editing application, there is a free open source program called Vue, and you'll find a web link to download the program within the web links folder, and free and open source applications within the training files that have come with this training. So to correct this, it's pretty easy. In Photoshop, what we can do is use image adjustments and go to threshold, and in the center should be alright. If you want to fine tune it, you can, but as you can see, if we go too far to the left or the right, it's going to create some problems. So if you do want it more jagged, you obviously can do that, but for animation that's not going to be a good idea. So we can stick about in the center, or move it up to a little bit higher. Really whatever you think is going to look best. Around the center should work. Just kind of pay close to the sides of the leaves to see what shows up best. So once that's applied, we're going to have a much crisper image and something that's going to work best for transparency map. It's a good idea to save this as a different format, because a JPEG is going to be compressed, and that compression leads to artifacts within the image, which is a large majority of what we were seeing within the original image. So what you want to do is use a raster type graphic file, or change it over to an indexed, so it's either there or it's not there. So if we go up to mode, set it to indexed color, it's going to give us a couple of different options. I've got mine set. We do custom. Or we can go and select exact and set it to black and white. Make sure there's no transparency and no dither. And then we can save this out. a really lightweight format for this is going to be the GIF format. I have noticed issues with the PNG files when used as transparency maps within host applications. If you're using xStream, the previews may not display correctly, or they could crash the program too. So stick with a GIF file. So we can go ahead and resave this out into our plants directory. So I'm going to save this as a GIF within the tree directory of the plants. And then what we can do is go back into Vue. We can, a couple of different ways we can do this. One way is within the links tab, we can just right click and reload the link. Or actually, we would need to replace the link, sorry. So we'll replace the link. And if you want to browse a file, you can go down here to the lower right and select this arrow to open up File Chooser. I do have the library already added in. Looks like that actually is a different one. So what we can do is if we want to add a new collection, we can go down here to the lower left, select New Collection. And it's going to go to our content installation folder. You can just go down to Plants and click OK. And I already have one called Plants, so I'll just add a 2 to the end of that. And this should bring in everything that's within that directory. So here is the fixed version. And now we shouldn't have that problem anymore. Now to show you, I already set up a couple of renders of what the plum tree looks like with the transparency and how that affects things. So I'll go ahead and open this up. And so that we can see the comparison, what I've done is taken just a red object and placed it underneath the plum tree leaves. You can see there's a lot of transparency issues around the edges. And if we switch over to the blue, I made a blue version and a red version. As I change between these two, you can see the red and the blue showing up around the edges. So obviously that's going to cause some issues. Now it might be a little hard for you to see with the encoded video because they are very small changes. But you should get the idea. And then the fixed version I've got right here, so cleaned up the edges a lot. And when you're farther away from these when they're rendering, because this is obviously meant for ecosystem, then everything, these jagged edges don't really matter. But you just want to make sure that there's really no transparency in those leaves. So that will correct that problem. Now another thing you can check for if you're running into any more issues, I know there are at least 1 or 2 plants here and there that are using texture interpolation. So if we open up the material and go into under the Transparency tab, we can right-click, edit the function, open up the function editor, and take a look at the projected texture map. The interpolation type is set to none, which is what it should be. But every once in a while you'll find one that's set to bilinear or normalized by cubic. And that's okay for a rough color map, if it's a grainy color map. But within the texture map, we don't want those edges smoothed. For a still image, that might be alright. If you're going to get a little closer to the plant, then you can smooth things out by using one of these interpolation modes. It will remove the pixelation. But for animation, it is important that you're using no interpolation. Now you can save out your plant species, new species, and be able to access the fixed version in the rest of your scenes. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this from here. And we're going to take a look at one more rare issue. So what we're going to do is load in a plant, and we're going to load in the wild plant. This one's got a couple of different issues with it. The most obvious is that the hooking points are all incorrect. So if we edit the object, and take a look, the hooking point is completely off for every single leaf subset. So for close-ups, it won't look very good. And you've got a lot of free-floating branches this way. So that's the main thing to correct that you can see. There is another issue, and it's not that obvious, but if we go to the second weed leaf material, or the subset number 2, and we open up the material, go into the function editor, we're going to find that instead of using a projected texture map, it's using an animation map. What this is going to do is not only switch frames and change the texture between frames of an animation, the output for an animation map is only half that of a regular texture map. Now, that's technically a bug, but because backwards compatibility with other scenes, it's something that's probably won't be fixed, just to ensure that all scenes from previous versions are loaded the same. Now, there are actually 2 images linked to this, and if we add in a connection to our time input, what we can do is add a constant node with the K icon over here, change that to a constant number, and connect this time input from the constant. Now if we go ahead and enter in a value of 1, we can see it changes the image. Set that back to 0, changes it again. So that it looks like I'm pretty sure there's only 2 frames embedded in this. But we don't want to use this texture map because it's just going to have way too many issues. Now technically we could correct the animation map, and as long as the time input isn't connected, it won't change during an animation. It does need to be connected to this top time output, which returns a value or an integer based on, or sorry, not an integer, because it does do the in-between second frames, but it returns the second. So if you've got returning a value of 1 second, it's going to output a value of 1. 2 seconds, value of 2. And then it will do the in-between frames. So since this isn't connected, it won't animate, but the scale is still wrong. So if you did want to fix it, you can just double the scale, change it to 2, because like I said, the animation map's only half the scale output for the UV coordinate. But the easier way is just to find this texture from another subset and copy and paste it over. So we can go to edit the object, and number 2 is the one that's messed up. So we'll just look for the other version of it, and it looks like they're actually all separate. So if you really do want the actual texture, what we can do is go into the links tab, and you also find that it is the bottom one animated that does not have any sort of file name to it. And what we can do is copy all texture maps to folder, and then we can choose a folder where we want to dump the textures from, either the selected image, or we can select all of them. If you hold down Shift, you can go through the list and select them. I know that the alpha is working fine, so we can stick with the alpha, but we do need the color maps. So after we do that, we have the 2 frames from whatever file type that was associated with. It might have just used the sequence of the numbers as well to create the frames. But the weed leaf TR2 is the one we need, so we can, and you could save that to your plants directory. I have this saved to just a different folder. So I've moved those into the plants directory. Now, in this case, replacing the texture map from the links tab won't correct some of those issues. So we're going to edit the material manually and go into the function, and we're going to change the animation map to a projected texture map. We can delete the UV coordinate. We're going to do the same thing for the bump map, which is just another copy of the color texture map. So we can select this and now load in that corrected file. And we can select it to load that in, and rather than just doing that again, what we can do is select this projected texture map, and then we can click off of it to get this red box and add in from the texture map option over here on the left, the icon. It'll recreate, and what it does is it'll always take the previous node that was selected and create a duplicate when you create that node with every session. One session being every time you open the function editor. So we do also actually need to make sure that those are set to flat vertical, and other than that, it should be ready to go. So now the plant is corrected, and you can save that out as a new species to have your own version of it that works properly. Another problem you can run into, go ahead and delete the wild plant, and I know that the Aurelia species under grasses and plants has a problem that shows up more in the OpenGL, although it could interfere with the render. What we see on the edge of every leaf is kind of a single bar or line of pixels. Now, it doesn't show up in the render, but if we were to render an animation with texture filtering, anti-aliasing, even though the leaf scales, if we take a look at the scale of the material, it's set to 102 as opposed to 1 to make sure that things like this are cut out. The OpenGL doesn't necessarily take into effect the actual scale used within the setting. It'll just take the texture map and map it to the outer edges and fit it in. So in order to get this image out and the alpha and fix it, to go over to the links tab, and you're going to notice there's something different about this type of file. And what it is a PRV file, which is sort of an internal Vue image file. If you select the alpha, right click, you find that the export link is grayed out, and if you copy all texture maps to the folder, it's not really going to do anything. Nothing will save. All you really need to do is go up to the top and select Incorporated, and then when you right click, you can export the link. If you're having any trouble saving the image in a specific file format, I would suggest trying bitmap file and then converting it later. Sometimes other image formats won't quite work. So then you can save this out, crop it, and cut out that strip that's showing, and then load in your new file. Now, the last thing I want to show you is how to correct the OpenGL display on double-sided leaves. If we load in a plant, if we load in the rubber plant from grasses and plants, this is one of those plants that has a double-sided leaf setup. It renders correctly, but obviously the OpenGL preview for it is kind of destroyed in the process, and that's because if we go to the leaf material and take a look, it's using a mixed material to control the distribution with the influence of environment. Unfortunately, even just cutting this out with an alpha is impossible. So what we have to do is condense both materials into one single layer, which which actually is pretty easy. Now, the only difference between these two, or the main difference, is what we have is an inverted color. So the color map, if you go to the top right, you can just invert it. And that's where that change is made for the color for the bottom leaf. And it has a color blend. If you take a look at the bump map, they are slightly different outputs. So there's a little change there too, but that one's also mostly inverted. So what we need to do is first we need that color blend. So what we can do is edit the color, and I'm going to drag this color into the color selection palettes and your favorites, and we've got that color available right there. We'll just have to remember that it's 42% of a color blend. We can go back to the main material, and what we're going to do is select these the swap button, and then we're going to select simple material, and that brings it down to one material layer. Now we can see the preview, but if we want those double-sided leaves back, we need to make a few changes. So we're going to right click and edit the function, and I've included a node or meta node that I've designed for this. Included with the trading in the project content, you're going to find a meta nodes folder, and what you want to do is take the meta nodes, there's one called top and bottom, and in your installation content directory for Vue, go to meta nodes and go to combiner, and then you can place the top and bottom node in there. So now whenever you have it installed into these folders, now if you don't have a folder for combiner, just create one. Once that's created and in there, you can right click in the interface, the function editor, go to combiner, meta nodes, and then it's going to list all of those files that are in there. So the top and bottom is available within the combiner meta node folder. So what we need to do is first make a copy of that texture map, and we're going to invert it. And then we're going to add in a color node, and we're going to change this to color correction, color blending. This is the same thing that we saw before in the interface. It's kind of a color blending node built in, which is also how we're going to trick the OpenGL into displaying the selected color map. It won't show the bottom within the OpenGL. It'll render it correctly, but at least we've got a leaf preview back better than those simple polygons. So what we want to do is connect this to that inverted texture. We're going to edit the color and select the color from the palette from our favorites. And the blending ratio, we just make a slight adjustment. Turn on the color mask. And now with top and bottom, there are 4 inputs. There are numeric inputs, and that's for using it with the bump. And then there's color, and that's for the color output. So if we hover over, we have a bottom color. We can connect that to our bottom image. And then we have a top color. We can connect that. So now we also need one more color blending node. First, we'll go ahead and select the color output. And it looks like I may have had the texture maps reversed. So I am going to just swap those inputs. And then it should show up correctly. Oh, it was just my preview over here on the right. I must have just been looking at it from a different angle, or a weird angle. Okay, so now we've got the top and the bottom set up for the color. The bump was a little different. So we'll create a copy of the bump. We want to invert it, and then we're going to go ahead and we can select the top and bottom node. We can copy and paste it and just delete the connections to the color. And then we'll select the numeric inputs for the bottom grayscale output of both. Line those up. And then we can connect that. Now if you remember, there is a difference in the output where our bottom bump is a lot stronger than the top. So what we want to do is add in a filter. So we're going to add a filter node, and I'm going to take this connection for the displacement and connect that to the top and bottom meta node. We're going to go to our filter, and we're just going to change this to divide, and we're going to go ahead and divide it by, let's say, 6. Click OK, and then we're going to go into bump, and we're going to set the bump output higher. So we're setting the overall bump higher, but because we've just divided and reduced the top, it should level out pretty well. Now, as you can see, we've got the transparency showing, but there's no color map. So what we need to do is trick the OpenGL for the color map, and we can do that with a color blending node. So what we do is create, we can right click, go to add color node, color correction, color blending. We're going to connect the top of this to whatever we want the OpenGL texture to be. So we'll just select that green one. We're going to extract the blending color with the extract parameter, the little lightning bolt looking thing, and take the constant node that's created, replace that with the output and what we actually want to render, set the blending ratio to 1, turn on color mask. So what this is going to do is take whatever is in the blending color and overwrite the input. It's just going to completely cover it up. But because the way the color blender is incorporated into the Vue material editor, it will preserve the OpenGL and allow you to pass through any texture. So now all we need to do is take the connection from the top and bottom and connect it to our color blender. Click OK, and OK again, and there we have the correct top and bottom node showing up. We've got that increased bump on the bottom, and we can adjust that overall output. We can go into that filter to reduce the other one if needed, or modify any of those settings. It looks like we might need to bring that down just a little. We'll do 0.05. And if the top bump is not strong enough, we can just go back into that filter and change the division to a lower number. You'll also find if you go back into the material editor, it just hadn't refreshed for me before. But now we see we're back to that mode before where we've got the color blend, the color mask, and the total blending color. Now the blend with color is going to show up even though it is connected directly to the top and bottom output node. And if you want, you can change the name of the material. And we'll set our scale to be 1.02 in order to make sure we're matching the scale typically used on all plants. Before, the mixed material had a global material scale of 102, and the individual maps were set to 1, which is why that's off a little bit. So if you want to take a look at a render, I'll go ahead and render that out. And I did forget to turn on anti-aliasing, so I went back, turned that on, and re-rendered it. But we can see everything showing up just fine. If you do want to change that underneath to get rid of that blue from the inversion, you can either apply another filter to it, or you can save out the texture map and edit it. Now you will find there is one problem that may show up. Now this is just going to happen no matter how it's set, no matter how the leaf is set up, whether you're using top and bottom node or not. But if we open up the plant and edit the flexibility, we'll go ahead and orient those up more. What we're going to see is leaves that are pointing up too far and the slope is changing too drastically will start to blend to the top image. So right here we have the top or the bottom showing, and then it blends into the top. And that's because this is controlled by slope. and there's really not much you can do about that. Even the mixed material will do the same thing if you apply this sort of flexibility to it. So there's really no way to get around that other than just making sure that none of the leaves are pointing straight up like that. As long as they're at their typically normal orientation, they should be okay. You can edit the node internally. There's a few settings that you can modify within the smooth threshold filter up the top for the connection to the slope. You can also clean out whatever you're not using. And if you see there is an on-off switch for the auto mode, what that does if you use it is it only affects the numeric output. It'll basically take whatever the top input is, invert it, and use that for the bottom. So if you only want to have one texture map, say this texture map here, we could disconnect the bottom, turn on the auto mode, and it will invert it. However, it won't add a filter in it to reduce the size output. Another thing we could do to change the color of this leaf, where we do have more of that purple look to it, is we can click the link between the top and bottom node and the color blending, and add another color node and set it to an HLS shift, and then we could just modify the hue. And it looks like we need to maybe pick it up a little bit. Now this is incredibly sensitive, the HLS shift. If you're using Snowflake from SLFX, it does include some much easier to control meta nodes for the HLS shift. It's definitely less sensitive. You can set sensitivity levels or use the easy color changer. And there's quite a few color nodes that are available, meta nodes within Snowflake. So most of these you're seeing within the meta nodes are from Snowflake. Although some of these, the balance have yet to be released, depending on when, of course, you've bought the training. But the intensity ranged is a nice workaround for the sensitivity of the HLS shift if you just want a quick adjustment. But what we'll do is just set this to 0.1 for the hue shift. And here we get a little better view of the bottom, and now we can see that most of that purple fringe on the edge is gone.